Please welcome moderator Will Giese and Lessons Learned Post-Net Energy Metering panel.
Aloha. You know, I grew up in a Methodist church. My mom is a Methodist preacher, and in the Methodist church, if anybody's ever been, they're really into call and response. And I gotta say, there's a lot of things I love about Hawaii since I've lived here, but that is probably one of my favorite things. Just as a quick note to you all, mainlanders who have never been here before. Anyway, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Hawaii Energy Conference. My name is Will Giese. This year I've had the honor to serve as part of the program committee for the conference. And I want to quickly mention my gratitude to both the planning committee and the Maui Economic Development Board for allowing me to be a part of this process. Please give them a round of applause. This has been a great conference so far. In my day job, I also serve as the executive director of the Hawaii Solar Energy Association, Hawaii's largest and oldest solar industry trade group. I've been involved in Hawaii energy policy for the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next 4 or 5 years or after that. Hawaii's distributed energy resources, or DER, industry has seen several major changes in the last few years, making it simultaneously, for me at least, an exciting and a quite terrifying time to be the director representing DER providers. In October of 2015, the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission ended the extremely popular Net Energy Metering Program, or NEM, making Hawaii one of the first states to have a post-NEM DER market. Today, as you might have seen in our program, the title of our conversation is Lessons Learned Post-Net Energy Metering. We will be discussing the end of the NEM program, what worked, what didn't work, and what the future holds for DER in Hawaii. So without further delay, I'd like to briefly introduce my panel, give them a few minutes to lay out their thoughts on this topic, and then we'll get into a discussion. We decided as a panel that presentations were maybe not the best use of our time, and rather just to have a discussion between the three of us and to take questions throughout from the audience and from myself as well. So that is basically the structure of our panel, as you'll see. So we'll start with Mr. Rich Barone. Mr. Rich Barone is the director of the Demand Response Division at Hawaiian Electric. He provides leadership and direction in DER strategy, grid service, market evolution, technology assessment, and program portfolio development. He has over 15 years of strategic planning, early stage technology, and system integration experience. In addition to Hawaiian Electric, Rich has worked with Navigant Consulting and Pacific Controls, Inc. on smart grid and demand response technologies. Next up is Mr. Isaac Moriwaki. Isaac serves as the managing attorney for Earth Justice's Mid-Pacific office. Earth Justice is a national environmental and clean energy law firm serving the national public interest. Isaac currently represents many clean energy organizations, including my own, the HSEA, and a variety of regulatory proceedings, including the DER docket and the community-based renewable energy docket. He also represented the HSEA and the Sierra Club of Hawaii in a recent court action to enforce the solar water heating mandate. Isaac has over a decade of experience in environmental and clean energy advocacy in Hawaii. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ted Peck. Ted is the president of Holuho, a Honolulu-based behind-the-meter development company. Ted has over 25 years of leadership experience in a variety of businesses and agencies, including Booz Allen Hamilton, serving as the energy administrator at the Hawaii State Energy Office, as some of you in this room might fondly remember, and as the president of Holu Energy. Ted has and continues to shape energy policy in Hawaii through private business ventures and through his leadership on a number of Hawaii-based clean energy organizations, such as the Distributed Energy Resources Council of Hawaii and the HSEA. So, Rich, we will start with you.
Thanks, Will. Aloha and good morning, everybody. And thanks for this opportunity to the Planning Committee to be up here with these fine gentlemen. Look, what we're looking at right now is an amazing and exciting opportunity, and I've been in the throes of this for 4 years and really didn't come at it from the NEM side necessarily or from DGPV, but rather demand response, and we're starting to see that confluence now upon us. If you look at our goals, 100% clean energy, 2045, and you look at our power supply improvement plan, In order for us to get there, 50% of the capacity of that system is going to be from customer-sited assets. What that means is that we're going to have to be a lot more nuanced and intelligent about leveraging those assets. And that means putting the right systems in place in terms of technologically, putting the right programs in place or market instruments in place to exercise control over those devices and making sure that there's compensation for that control. So what this means for us, as you've seen in our integrated grid planning work plan, as well as what you will be seeing in the DER strategy document coming out here in the next couple of months, is our 3 Ps, pricing, programs, and procurement. Those mechanisms are going to be the channels through which we look to build sustainability of the DER market, but also operationability of those assets for our system. So in order for us to do that, the point here is we have to find the right balance. Okay, we all know about the end customer. We can never forget about the end customer. Let's call that the little c. Then there's the folks who help the little c build value and put devices in their homes or businesses. Then there's the big C. And I know some people might jadedly think the big C is the company. Yes, to an extent that's true. But it's also all of our customers. So what we're looking to find here is the balance of value between the participating customer, the market entrants, the participants, the vendors, and then, of course, all of our customers and ratepayers, because we have to do this in a way that's going to be economically beneficial to all parties for this to be sustainable. So that's sort of my substrate here as we proceed into this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Rich. Isaac, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Will. So when I first saw the title of this session, I thought to myself, well, what do we get signed up here for? Because, I mean, if you read the description, it's a bit backward looking, and I guess in these types of conferences, we want to be more focused on moving forward. But there have been lessons learned post-NEM and still ongoing challenges. So, okay, yes, let's look back to move ahead. And I think, in terms of starting with NEM or post-NEM, I just got to throw out there in the beginning, at least to set the current context of the local solar industry, that the transition from NEM probably could have been handled better. The process was difficult. I speak from personal experience, and even more so the result, right? So in 2016, the year after NEM closed, the local industry contracted by 30%, and then another 30% the year after that. Today, we're less than half of what it was before NEM. And back before NEM, about 20 to 25 companies comprised about 75% of the market. Today, that's down to 5 companies, basically holding the same proportion of market share. So not only the size of the pie, but also the diversity, right? And so, as far as, well, this was a necessary, inevitable market correction, I have to disagree. Not like this. It's ultimately about the transition, and we're still transitioning. 3 years after the end of NEM, we're still trying to figure out where are we transitioning to. So with that as the context, I think part of the description is also what are the top 10 fixes, and I guess we have a lot to talk about on that as well. I'll just throw out for a conversation starter, at the highest level, the most zoomed out level, we really need to re-envision the paradigm for distributed energy resources in Hawaii. And this has been something that came up from the beginning, and frankly, it's still ongoing, right? We need to shift the paradigm from DERs as something that happens to the utility, something that we need to shoehorn into the grid via hosting capacity, and that's a loaded term, right, from the start. Something that we need to differentiate as private solar versus whatever else. Instead, we need to embrace DERs as an integrated and integral part of the future grid. I mean, everyone knows this, and yet, here we are. It's still the top sort of paradigmatic challenge that we face, and I think underlies this whole conversation, not only in this, but other DER-related panels today.
Great. Thanks, Isaac. And then Ted, please.
So bear with me. On the 19th of February, I left Holu. My parent company went into receivership, and I've spent the last 5 weeks standing up Holu Ho. On Monday, we, all the old folks that came over to Holu Ho started, so we're off and running. But I've been a little distracted. So that takes quite a bit of energy, but it is exciting. And actually, the Holu Ho means new resilience, and new resilience is really what we want to create on the grid, and also embodies kind of us not going away even as NSYNC goes away. So on the topic at hand, if I may, I often beckon back to Samuel Insull. I think he's a very interesting character in helping us understand the electricity markets. He was a protege of Thomas Edison. He went up and stood up the utilities in Chicago, basically buying up generators and buildings, linking them together and driving down cost, and demonstrating that you can drive down costs by larger central station generators. Renewable energy, as an alternative, is by its nature a distributed asset. And so, as Isaac said, we really need to not shoehorn distributed and teach it as a come along. In fact, if you look at the RPS from last year, 40% of the RPS energy, the renewable energy on the HECO grids, is from distributed generation. And really, we have the capacity for 3 to 4 times that. So maybe what we ought to do is, we talk about our RPS, we ought to treat distributed generation in a different way, since the company is not directly paying for it. All the company's doing is interconnecting it. And as Rich said, they do have to procure central station generation on a renewable basis, and they need to interconnect the distributed generation. I think what has happened in Puerto Rico, and the discussion of a set of interconnected microgrids, and the discussions that are happening here, are really a foreteller of the transition that we're moving to, where people 10 years ago just talked about envisioning it. It's really happening. And my last comment will be that the more we expose the industry and the company to market forces, the better our customers are going to be served. It's a natural temptation to be a central planner. Central planning has a lot of history of not working. I would say we need to think more as setting the playing field, making sure we have good rules, and then let the game begin.
Okay, thank you guys. So before we start into questions, I want to remind everybody in the audience, and some of you are already putting them in, but if you go to, I think it's sift.ly, and enter the code, you can enter questions at any time throughout our panel. I'm going to be asking some questions of my own, obviously, but as I see some good ones pop up, I've already seen some, I'll ask those as well. So if you have any burning questions that you want to ask this panel, please do that throughout the panel. So I want to pivot to Isaac. So Isaac, you have a lot of experience, obviously, representing the HSEA throughout the industry, longer than I've been involved in it here in Hawaii, and you've seen pre-NEM and post-NEM, the industry. And I wanted to ask you kind of what your thoughts were on, if we could go back in time and transition again, as opposed to the way that we did in 2015 that you critiqued, how might you want to do that?
Okay, so can everyone? Well, that's the kind of backward-looking sort of talk that maybe we didn't want to focus on, but, sort of quarterbacking after the fact. I think there could have been much more systematic plan of how we transition from here to there. Just at the highest level, maybe like California did, stage it over several years, figure out what you're going to do in the interim for a longish term, and then maybe where you're headed to after that. And then, more specifics, things like monthly reconciliation of the bills came out of nowhere. That was something that really caused the industry a lot of grief and consternation. It wasn't discussed by any of the parties, but that's an example of a micro sort of issue that maybe could have been handled a lot more smoothly.
So I bring this up because currently I think we have 5 or 6 different tariff programs that we're operating on post-NEM. And some of those tariff programs are shorter in that they can, be redone after 2 years, or they can be re-examined, and some of them, we're trying to kind of look at what the future DER tariff is going to be, right? And so, I think, yes, it is a little bit backward-looking, but you could have kind of a forward vision in how we develop these types of tariffs. So also go to Rich, on this same kind of question, how do you view our current tariffs post-NEM, and how might they want to change from HECO's perspective in the future, and how might you want to implement those changes?
Well, I could never speak for the entire company, but what I would say is this.
He told us he was going to say that pretty early on.
But one thing I'll point out is maybe not as efficiently as could have been done, to your point. This sort of stratified approach to programs, in a sense, has been a transitional staged approach to migrating away from NEM. And maybe the onset always feels and seems to be sudden. But I think you've seen these things roll out sequentially since NEM was sort of terminated, and so I will say that this has been a form of a transitional stage, which may still be flawed, but I think that I want to just kind of couch that as saying I think that we're in the throes of that. Where does that lead to, I think, is your question. And at the end of the day, I think for simplicity purposes for all parties, I mean, including customers, including the vendors that are out there putting stuff in the ground, and from the company perspective as well, creating a singularity, some form of a program or rate structure that kind of combines everything, truncates everything into a single, straightforward, extensible rate structure that moves us into the future, helps out a lot of things. If it's structured correctly, it affords the company with the kind of right degrees of, if you will, control or visibility to what's being produced and exported in particular, or at least even used. On the one hand. On the other hand, it provides, look, maybe this will never be, I hate to be, this is blasphemy, but it might never be the same economic value that NEM was, kicking out, retail rates for every kWh exported. But whatever the economic value amounts to be, and we're looking at a few different ways to combine this with grid service, opportunities as well, then if that has legs and it's a longer-term view, then whatever that economic value story is, it creates stability, if you will, for the market. And I think that's the kind of thing that allows for longer-term planning, and then gets the second wave that Ed alluded to earlier. That might be the type of thing that allows for that second wave to happen, because you're going to have a lot more market certainty.
Okay, so one of the things I think about with NEM as a tariff program is that it only valued the amount of energy that you would give back to the grid, right? Because you got that back in an energy credit that was retail rate. And now we're having lots of conversations in the IGP docket, the PBR docket, DER strategy dockets, and other types of regulatory proceedings where we are exploring the concept of procuring grid services from these DERs. So Ted, I want to talk to you a little bit about, as somebody who runs a development company and has been involved in that, both the policymaking and the end-use implementation. How do you see this kind of procurement of grid services by DER developing? What would you prefer, or how might it make it easy for both the developer and the consumer and the utility to have these types of procurements?
Well, I'll start by saying that, to Isaac's point, I think the real challenge with the transition from NEM was that we had a very nascent tariff to replace it. CGS, we've abandoned CGS because it was flawed in that it took an annualized asset and broke it up in months, and so it was very difficult to build against. And even on all the tariffs we're doing, we are pioneers, and so we're building as far as we could see. So I think moving to kind of a unified approach to the value that distributed generation brings to the grid, not just energy, but all the ancillary services, and getting that all baked in. There's not going to be here's a solution, let's move it out. I mean, the NFL Rules Committee meets every off season and looks at, are these rules good, and adjusts them. and we need to be doing the same thing. During the whole NEM time, there was at least 24 studies across the country on the value and the cost of NEM resources to the grid. Most of them focused on the cost. Very few of those studies actually looked hard at the value that distributed resources brought in terms of whether or not we do NEM. It does make sense to me from an energy standpoint that there needs to be some determination what that value is, because all we did is we set it at retail. And that's clearly, everything else is going to be wrong, but that's definitely wrong, right? So we just need to do analysis, not just for the value of the energy, but all the other things. And we need to do it in a transparent fashion. I know the company is very sensitive about the information on what it costs to deliver those services, but I think that in order for us to do something that we're all comfortable with, everybody wants to see the Moeller report. We want to understand the costs of the energy that's brought. I think that makes sense. And that's a difficult discussion for us to have, but I think we need to have it.
May I add to that?
Yeah, just you guys are free to add to anybody,
okay.
so I talk less.
I think it's impressive that in the context of this NEM discussion, that Ted brought up NFL Rules Committee and the Mueller report. Just, I couldn't have scripted that. But to his points about transparency and about collective value, I think there's firstly, so 4+ years now I've been at the utility, and what I've seen is a true transformation from the company side, led by our leadership to promote true and honest stakeholder engagement. It's been a thread with everything we've done, with the grid mod strategy, and now very evident, I hope, with IGP, and certainly the DR docket, and now the DER docket, thematically really promoting that, to have that dialogue so that we're not in a situation where when something goes in front of the commission, the rest of the stakeholders and interveners are looking at each other, scratching their heads. And I think that's been a huge positive step in the right direction, very effective. And yeah, this stuff's iterative, and this is part of the challenge, right? So that's one point I wanted to make. But I think to your other point about the all-in value, the soft launch we're doing within the integrated grid planning, the non-wires alternative soft launch, is a really good, and I think tooting our own horn on the grid services stuff, we've really tried to kind of pair that in there as well. But we are starting to move in a direction of recognizing these values and making sure that we kind of contract for that value through rolling up of these resources. So I just want to assert that I think we're getting there. We're getting that message, and as a company, we're moving in that direction.
So, adding to what Rich has said, I agree that the companies have been working really hard to figure out where we're headed to next, and the grid service piece is the real important component of what we're transitioning to. That question of where we're going after NEM. And so, Rich, I think you don't get enough credit for all the credit you already get about how you've been talking about that for years, and it's taking some time, but you're making progress, and I think that's where we're ultimately headed as far as doing value of DER here in Hawaii properly. And what you said in terms of merging the DER demand response and DER is really key, and that should have happened a long time ago, but it's now happening under Shelley Kimura leading that department, so that's a good development as well. You mentioned another thing about we're in the transition, and that's, I guess, the product or the product of that, or the result of that, are all these sort of various tariffs that are kind of complicated and different. So it seems like we're in the stage of a lot of interim steps, and even interim kind of like moves where the hallway gets longer and longer the more we try to figure something out. For example, the smart export program that we have now is really innovative for the country, but it was meant by the industry when we proposed it a couple years ago as just a no-brainer baby step of, okay, let's agree not to even export anything during daytime solar production hours, and then introduce the concept of premium export rates during the on-peak hours. And it took us 9 months to get that going, and then months after that to get the tariffs right. So I think in general, and again, great, giving the credit for the steps we're making forward, we need to reduce the windup and maximize the plug-and-play aspect.
Okay, so just to clarify, you said that the end of NEM happened too fast and you wanted a better transition, but the transition's too slow? Is that what I'm hearing? No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I agree. So here's the thing about even baby steps, is that there are, even what sometimes I think appears to be obvious solutions are not obvious. What ramifications would there be if you suddenly had a high penetration circuit where you're exporting from 5 to 9? Maybe from the system perspective, it certainly helps with the supply-demand balance, but are you creating or running into any constraints on the circuit level, for example? And then, of course, getting into the issues of what's the right value for that, how do you measure it, how do you make sure everybody gets a fair piece of that value? I think I recognize that processes take a very long time. But I want to, I think, put forth, certainly as somebody who never worked for a utility before 4 years ago, so came into this pretty, I think, naive myself about how stuff should or could happen, is that there are levels of complexity that it is prudent to proceed to some degree with caution, which I understand that lengthens that hallway, but the flip side to that is if you rush into something that winds up having unintended consequences or isn't in fact beneficial to the entire system, unwinding things like that can be very, very painful and disruptive to the market. And I think that's the counterpoint to what you're suggesting.
Well, I want to push back against that, though, because I think that there's a great nature, certainly in the culture of the utility space, to be very, very cautious. I think that we have the opportunity to take more risk. And, CGS is a great example. It wasn't as well designed, so we closed it and moved on to new tariffs. So, we can make a mistake and say, oh, that was a mistake, and change it, and not be all that damaged from that. I think it would be a worthwhile exercise, if there is something you're saying, ooh, that looks a little crazy, to explore what's really the worst case scenario, the reasonable worst case scenario, because often we come up with very unreasonable worst case scenarios that are horrific, but they'll never really happen. So what is a worst case scenario that's reasonable in that way? And I think it is really critical what we're doing now in the time frame that we're doing it, because distributed generation today, if you want to isolate from the grid, if you want to go off grid, it's going to cost you money to do that. That is not going to be the case forever. And we are rapidly coming to a place, I have a 2011 EV that has a day and a half range. I have a 2018 EV that has 5 days range. And so it's very quick where your home will have 3 to 4 days of storage, and separating from the grid seems to be a pretty easy thing. People need to have a reason to stay on the grid, and grid services are that reason.
So fail fast maybe is a way to address some of that.
Well, I think that's one approach or mindset, but then to your point about somehow I was inconsistent in terms of go slow but can go fast, I think the key is continuity, right? There was a transition that could have happened where you sort of see the end point or whatever, and then steps along the way where instead of the curtain coming down and then trying to figure out after the fact, okay, what sort of interim step are we going to come up with now?
Right, so maybe bringing in some of these interim measures before the curtain closed would have been a better way of reorganizing that.
So I want to move us on a little bit from this topic and talk about kind of future stuff. And I compare it, I guess, somewhat to the old NEM. In my involvement in these conversations, and I know the three of you are also involved at the regulatory level, what is kind of in vogue now is this concept of a platform model, where we have aggregated DER and there's a kind of a platform market, which we're all kind of trying to figure out what the design of that would look like. And we're not the only state that's trying to figure that out too, right? New York, California, other countries are trying to figure this out as well. And so I guess I'll pose this question to all three of you, maybe, and I assume you'll all have different opinions, but we'll start with Isaac. From your perspective, well, we're just going down the line. What do you think, what would be a good facilitator, or how can we facilitate a good interaction between DER companies, aggregators, and the utility in a future platform model to allow for all these DER resources to be maximized? and utilized efficiently?
First, I think you got to start with the utility model and the utility incentives, but I don't want to steal thunder from a panel that I know is coming later. It's all about the model, the regulatory and the business model. So if you have that lined up right, then the question is, how do you integrate fully optimized DERs with that model? And I think it goes to Rich's point about the 3 Ps. I know there's a lot of focus on all-source procurement now, and the commission in a really key recent order emphasized that the companies should not only focus on utility scale procurement, but also a DER side procurement process as well. I think that's important, but that the focus on procurement may be too limiting, and that we also need to look at the other 3 Ps, 2 Ps of the 3, and maybe even start with the pricing P in terms of to set sort of like price signals in the market as a baseline. Everyone can sort of shift to that, and you turn the whole ship that way, and then at a more targeted level start, your procurement or your programs, as needed, even on a circuit level or location or what have you. But I think, anyway, I'll start it there, and that's the way you start attacking it as far as really integrating DERs as part of this new model.
Yeah, am I next? I think,
Sure.
I first of all, to your first point, the utility business model, I think there's a lot of key elements in PBR that are going to help foster that part of the equation, and we'll not get into that at the moment, but that is a piece of this, making sure that the utility can have a stake in kind of if beneficially running the system more cost effectively. There should be some kind of assignment of value for doing so. In terms of the rest of the model, it gets interesting and complicated. To your point, Isaac, we are starting, I think the way we've put this forth in the IGP does start with pricing. So to your point, it kind of get the foot in the door there. But what's interesting, I don't want to lose this in the shuffle, as we've been talking to folks about the DER strategy document. If you proceed with the aggregator model, there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between the folks that are going to play the aggregator role and the folks that are out there installing systems in people's homes. And we have to be very careful and thoughtful about how to protect the local economic interest in an aggregator model and making sure that we can help play matchmaker between the aggregators are going to come in here and actually do the heavy lifting in terms of the intelligent organization and optimization of these assets, and the folks that are out there physically selling and installing the assets, and how can we help foster that portion of the market is going to be very important. The third leg of the stool is the customer themselves, simplifying the opportunities for customers, who's best equipped to do that, and how does both the aggregator or the installer maintain the customer relationship, but also protecting the fact that the company, the utility, wants to also maintain the relationship with those customers. So how do you walk that line? How do you, and it's going to probably vary on customer segment. For example, I suspect the utility will have a better role as a shepherd to the commercial customers than maybe the mass market kind of residential customers in terms of helping to make those introductions and simplify the offering. So there's some complexities to it, but some of the ways that we've proceeded in the grid services purchase agreement with sort of co-branding efforts to make sure that customers see this as a unified effort should be one piece in kind of a complicated machinery.
Ted?
Just for the record, I hate procurements. I hated doing them when I was at the state. When I came on board, the Senate was holding hearings about a procurement my boss had overseen. And procurements, when you're in industry, especially, frankly, the utility runs really painful procurements. That tends me to say I like tariffs a little better. You can get both of them wrong. It's really critical, as you said. I really absolutely agree that if you make your procurement really difficult, then it's going to be the big boys that come in and do the aggregation, even though local innovators can do the aggregation. So you got to lower the bar and make it not so onerous for people to compete. Procurements take a lot of time. So the other side is you need to do multiple awards so people have a sense of this is not a 1 in 7 shot. I'm going to put in a proposal and spend a tremendous amount of my time and money and take a lot of opportunity costs and be out of the market because I'm trying to do this thing and I walk away with nothing. So the utility really needs to be thoughtful. You know, you're used to procuring from IPPs, and those are big muscle movements. And so your procurement system is designed for that kind of stuff. You kind of got to have a small kind frame of mind in procuring these kind of distributed resources and really be thinking in terms of multiple award.
Pivoting again, I want to talk about something that I'm not sure gets covered a whole lot, but I want to cover it between at least Ted and Rich about customer experience. And when we look at old NEM, you know, and I'm kind of echoing a little bit of what Ed Finster said, or thematically talked about, was simple is better. You know, NEM was, I think, a 2 or 3 page interconnection agreement. It was very, very simple. And then CGS and CSS and all the other subsequent programs became much more complex. And from a customer perspective, the customer's interaction on those types of agreements became more complex, right? So as we move forward, you know, possibly away from these 5 tariffs or improving them, or having another kind of overarching tariff that we want to see, how does the customer interaction change? Does it become simpler? And how can it become simpler when the product offering is more complex? I guess I will turf this one to Rich from the utility perspective, and then to Ted from the developer perspective.
Thanks. It's sort of the counterpoint to the tariff preference, right? And there, to your point, the tariffs have gotten a little bit more complicated because the rules are more complicated, right? And one of, look, I mean, this is it's not a church and state thing for me, but I know that our first order has been to pursue procurements through the aggregator model in the context of demand response and effectively control over customer-sited assets for extraction of grid value, right? And one of the key tenets there that I've thought all along has been maybe a promising element to this is have a lot of the granularity and complexity, and I am parroting a little bit of some language that came up in conversations with Ed yesterday and others. The complexity can be handled between the company and the counterparty, the aggregator. And the intent would be to create a more simplified interface with the customer. For example, that vehicle in the context of the grid services purchase agreement is a participant agreement between the aggregator and the customer. Of course, we want to see that, make sure the customer is protected. But the tenets of that should be much more straightforward, a couple pages max. The incentive that they're going to receive on their bills for participating in this program are very clearly delineated and straightforward. And the aggregator does the heavy lifting of managing the device, minimizing customer impact. So I know that it's an ideal worldview, but that's one of the big, I think, advantages to the aggregator model and that contract structure is that it does simplify the customer perspective and make the offering easier.
So just to clarify, the aggregator would be taking kind of the brunt of this complexity when the customer themselves that is interacting with the aggregator does it in a more simplified manner.
Correct.
Okay. Ted?
I absolutely agree, and I think it was a smart move to make the aggregators put together the participation agreement on the utility. I think it was a very mature move because, you know, they're the ones who are going to have to sell this, right? And they're the ones that have to explain, here's how this works. You know, you oversight, great, that makes sense. But, you know, whether it's just a PPA for energy delivered behind the meter, you know, the utility doesn't have to sell electricity in the sense of you don't have electricity salespeople, right? You have customer leads that kind of maintain those relationships. The expertise in selling is out in the DG market. Those are the people who know how to sell and how to get those assets in place. And doing it as a co-branded approach just makes a ton of sense.
Really quickly, I'm glad you know, Rich and the HECO companies are already recognizing the difficulty of focusing solely on aggregators as the vehicle to make this happen. And this goes directly to Ted's point, which I think was so key, and I was nodding furiously the entire time about how that's a certain type of model, but you know, you really, to be the platform of the future or whatever, you need to open your doors to all customers, not necessarily just through aggregators, and that's where I think the tariff side of things is the key, and that is you cannot forget that piece, and you can't.
And just to follow off on that, on the first RFP, a lot of players fell out, a lot of resources fell out, and I think it would be an instructive thing, and I'm sure you have, I'm not trying to school you, but to really ask why. Why did those resources fall out? And to go back to them, why did you not bid people that you expected to bid? What were the barriers that kept people from playing? Because there are real barriers, and we've talked about a number of them. So get that feedback and then redesign the system. What would be really good for the customers is if you could get all of those resources at a good, fair market price and, really accelerate that transition to a distributed spongy grid.
Plug and play, baby.
Okay, we have about 4 minutes left, and I want to ask kind of one question to the group, and we'll start with Rich. Traditionally with NEM, it was provided by third-party installer contractors. That's still the case today with tariff programs. But in the future, does the utility have an opportunity to participate in the DER market? How might they do that? Should they do that? And how does that look? We'll start with Rich, and then I'll let you two respond too. And we have 4 minutes.
Well, geez.
It was that question, or what would you do if you were a commissioner of the PUC? So I wanted to do this one.
All right, I'll take this one then. I think, look, the company continues to, the great work led by Shelley and now Jim Alberts, to continue to explore where sort of new opportunities are to bring value into the company, and I think share that value with our customers. So without question, this would become an area of interest and great viability if the right regulatory pieces were in place to allow for that. And I know Sean McCormick's here in the audience, and he's directly been charged with kind of new business opportunities, new products and services. Something we've talked a lot about. I think it's reasonable. You for example, in the PPA arena, you've got self-build options now, right? The company is permitted to go ahead and file a self-build option. That seems like a very reasonable corollary to doing, I don't know, for example, think of a self-deliver option for aggregated services through customer engagement. What does that mean in terms of owning and managing assets on the customer side of the meter? That's an interesting regulatory question, right, that I couldn't address here. But certainly it'd be of great interest and potentially great value, especially if the company could deliver those services at a lower price point.
I'll let you guys respond in the last 2.5 minutes.
Over the last 150, 200 years,
2.5 minutes.
it's going to be short. Oil companies and utilities have shaped the modern world that we have today. And in doing so, have built up a tremendous amount of capital. Technology is transforming. We need to find a way to bring that capital to bear in that transforming technology and allow that capital either in a regulated way, which I would say, or in an unregulated way is preferable, but for that capital to compete in the market and to play in the market makes sense to me.
Isaac, any response?
Well, so I agree with Ted that it's all about the market. And then the question is, letting the utility play in the space, is that going to kill the market or is it going to foster the market? And so that's a policy discussion that's going to require a lot more than 1 minute. But
if you say it's the utility, that's not the market. It's got to be external to that, because the utility is the utility as a regulated entity.
Right. Maybe there are opportunities there that could be served by the utility. For example, in the community-based renewable energy program, the utility has a dedicated space where it can serve at least 50% low to moderate income customers in its projects. I still don't know whether the utility is going to follow up on that opportunity, but maybe there are those types of segments that are available at least to start the conversation. We have a long history in Hawaii and elsewhere as far as rules for the utility playing in a competitive space like DERs. So a lot of things would need to get worked out before we fully dive in.
Okay. Well, in the last 30 seconds, I kind of wish that we were a band so I could ask the audience if they wanted an encore, because I could sit here and talk about this for a while or listen to you guys, because I learned so much just by osmosis almost. But I want to thank Isaac Moriwaki, Rich Barone, and Ted Peck for coming up and talking on this topic. It's really fascinating, and it really is kind of the future. So please give them a round of applause for it.
Thanks to you. Good job. Thanks for being a show.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.